Welcome everyone to the fifth satsang of this series of satsangs. The last few satsangs I had focused on a behind-the-scenes look at, in a sense, explaining how teachings work, what changes they're trying to bring about, and also trying to emphasize that a lot of top-down teachings are trying to get us to essentially turn inwards. I don't mean necessarily turn inwards in the way you might imagine, but to turn inwards and recognize that the momentary experience is actually an experience. And so from that perspective, it's not about what is happening in the experience, but rather to see the very nature of experience and to explore, for example, content versus awareness, and that really is very much based on certain experiential shifts. It's not really something you can explore intellectually. You really do need the aid of a change in your experience, and that requires a seeker to be really interested in coming to understand what is meant by experience, consciousness, and the experience arising in consciousness. So that is a particular path or a particular part of seeking that is more interested in the nature as a basic principle rather than practical daily living. And that exploration, if life is seen differently as an experience rather than the experience creating the impression of a person and an external world, which is how the experience is normally known, and therefore it's not really known as experience. It's just like, oh, I'm experiencing the world. It's not even, the experience part fades away. The fact that it's all arising in consciousness sort of isn't noticed. And then we might become interested in trying to essentially become aware of the experience as an experience. And if that shift happens, it really means that there is a shift in the wiring. I would say the wiring, the neurology of the person, that is now aware of the fact that the experience of life is something arising within their consciousness, which really means an image arising inside their brain. So talking about that and talking about how teachings affect the brain and turn certain functions of the brain on and off, which have an effect on how the experience is constructed and therefore have an effect on how experience can be realized or recognized by the experience itself to be experience. So that's a change on one level of the seeker. When it comes to happiness, that change that I'm talking about, a change in the way the life experience is recognized, is not really enough about peace of mind in daily living. In order for there to be peace of mind in daily living, we really have to acknowledge that the peace of mind is for the human being, for the individual, and we have to start looking at the circumstance and the content of life. The fact that there is a human being that wakes up in the morning, interacts with other human beings, goes through its day, doing various things, functioning, speaking, thinking, all according to its makeup and the circumstance it finds itself in. And when we start investigating life on that level, it starts to become very apparent what interactions turn into suffering. More specifically, what attitude towards the interactions turns or creates suffering. So as many of you have heard me say many times before, at least once in every video, I would think, it's very important for us to become very clear that actually all I'm looking for is the end of suffering, which in its flip form, invert form, the end of suffering really means peace of mind. And peace of mind doesn't mean a fantastic life. It doesn't mean the human being becoming a saint or a perfect human being. It really means life unfolding more or less as it always has, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. The human being having its good points and its bad points, and that being essentially part of the circumstance when things happen, and the human is part of those interactions. So the human will have their behaviors. They may be very patient, they may be less patient than someone else. And it's not so much about perfecting or controlling. It's not really about the pleasure or pain in the flow of life. But peace of mind is about the internal attitude towards whatever is happening. So when we really get down to it, we just say, look, I'm not looking for myself or others to be perfected. I'm not looking for my life circumstance to change radically. I'm not expecting my life to change from me being in a certain socioeconomic class to being in the top socioeconomic class, being the richest group of people on earth, having the most amazing relationships. It's, if that's what our objective is, we have essentially dropped the priority of peace of mind, and we've replaced it with the priority of a perfect life, as in a perfect life circumstance, perfect life situation, which really means that we have said internally, whether we realize it or not, that my happiness, my completeness is to be found in circumstance. What we're saying, if we put peace of mind aside, we may never have considered peace of mind, and we act as if our happiness is linked to circumstance, then we're basically prioritizing circumstance. And prioritizing circumstance, as opposed to saying, look, if I experience peace of mind on a continuous, unbroken basis, I know from my own experience that circumstance is not the be-all and end-all of life. In fact, I understand intellectually that circumstance is always changing. If I am fortunate and I receive something very pleasurable, something very beneficial, at some point it's going to change. At some point, the things that I hold dearest to me are going to fall away. So we can start to recognize that seeking the perfect life actually has its problems, because life on a circumstantial level is always changing. So this deep recognition, often based on the fact that suffering is present, so the suffering can be a godsend in a way in the seeking, because we can suffer for years and years and years, even once we've started seeking, and still not realize that what we're really looking for is just the end of that suffering. We can seek for years and years and years, still with the old attitude that says my happiness is to be found in circumstance. And so the suffering essentially is arising over and over and over again in order for us to become familiar with it, in order for us to be able to see the attitude that is the attitude of suffering, in order for us to one day realize, actually, all I want is to feel at peace with myself in life. When that realization happens in a really deep way, because I'm sure we can hear it and agree with it. But often when we hear and agree with something, it's on what we could call the intellectual level. Now, the intellectual level is very important. It means, yeah, I understand the principle, I understand the concept. However, there's usually a time, a moment where circumstance and the intellectual understanding meet. So it means that the circumstance really demonstrates or really allows the deep, deep recognition in that moment that all I'm looking for is the end of suffering. And in that moment, when it really becomes blatantly obvious to us based on something in that very moment, which could include, let's say, a contrast between where you feel completely at peace and you might have the thought that says, you know, life is so great, it's so easy, nothing particularly wonderful is happening at the moment. And yet here I am sitting on the bench, completely at ease and content with life exactly the way it is, not thinking about the past, not thinking about the future, not having any complaints or worries in the present moment. And then if in that instant suffering were to overcome the body, it may be one of these moments I'm talking about where the contrast allows us to see and really confirm for ourselves, actually all I'm looking for in life. So consciously understand, recognize, all I'm looking for is for this peace to remain undisturbed. So once that becomes really clear, then the seeking has dropped down into a new level, essentially, and there's going to be an amazing shift in effectivity. And that is because our mission to understand all of the forms of suffering that arise particular to the seeker themselves, because every seeker is unique. So every seeker has a very unique psychological identity that has been put in place. And the psychological identity is, let's say, the grounds of the thinking mind. And the thinking mind is the space in which all of the suffering is created. Rather, you could say the suffering and the thinking mind are the same thing. And the suffering and the thinking mind stem from the psychological identity, and the psychological identity is essentially a deeply ingrained set of beliefs about personal doership and attachment to outcomes. And so what I've just described is where suffering comes from. So the psychological identity based on a deeply ingrained set of beliefs of personal doership and attachment to outcome, meaning what I believe I need in order to be complete and happy. That's the mistake of looking for happiness on the outside. And that psychological identity, when it is in life, which really basically means in the waking state, is forced to feel uncomfortable with being alive. It feels more uncomfortable usually when circumstances delivering pain, or when there is pleasure and then the thinking mind starts worrying about the end of the pleasure. And as I was saying, every seeker is uniquely different in terms of their psychological blueprint. And so the different forms of suffering, or there are going to be different forms of suffering in each seeker. And there won't just be one form of suffering, there'll be many different manifestations of suffering. When I say many, really they fit into one of these 5 categories: guilt, blame, and pride. Guilt, blame, and pride. Worry and anxiety. Expectation and attachment to outcomes. So 5 broad categories. Now, some seekers won't exhibit some of the forms of suffering very much. So, for example, if you tend to be very proud, which is a form of personal doership or a form of a manifestation of suffering stemming from personal doership, then you are unlikely to feel a lot of shame. And similarly, the person that feels a lot of shame is unlikely to feel a lot of pride. The person that feels pride and blame as their forms of suffering is unlikely to feel shame. There could be some people that experience a lot of worry and anxiety, and other people that don't have worry and anxiety, but they have a lot of attachment to outcome and expectations of how life should look and how the other should behave. So everyone's going to have their unique set of different forms of suffering. So once we've become clear on the fact that really my seeking is for something very simple, something very specific. At the beginning of the seeking, I might have thought it was about all sorts of things, about understanding the universe, about knowing myself as awareness, and so on and so on, maybe having special powers, becoming a perfect human being. And as our maturity develops, our seeking maturity, you could say, it becomes more and more apparent, and it hits us one day. Actually, I'm just looking for peace of mind. And then if we acknowledge, if we come to recognize from our own experience, peace of mind is just the absence of suffering. And suffering is based on the psychological identity, and it manifests in different forms. Then we start to be interested and start to see our own suffering as it arises. And we need to ask ourselves a question. What is the attitude towards life that is in place that allows suffering to arise? Because suffering is not based on the circumstance we find ourselves in. Suffering is not inherent in circumstance, which is either pleasure or pain. So if you get an illness and you're out of action, bedridden for 2 weeks, that is circumstantial. It is part of the biological reactions of the body. It may be painful. It may be inconvenient. It may cost you money. So there is physical pain. There's the pain of inconvenience. There's financial pain. There may be a lack of meeting your normal preferences of, for example, being outside and being able to exercise. So there's that circumstantial pain. But none of those things inherently in and of themselves fall into the category of suffering. They fall into the category of pleasure or pain. Some people might find it very pleasurable because they say, yes, I have, I'm not able to get out of bed. I'm very tired, but it gives me the chance to take a break from work. And they say, I needed a break from work. And so actually it's a great pleasure to be sick because I'm able to take rest. So the circumstance is either pleasurable or painful based on the person's biological preferences put in place. It's part of their makeup. So if circumstance is in line with your biological preferences, it's pleasurable. Circumstance is not in line with your biological preferences, it's painful. And life is always going to be circumstance, which is always either pleasure or pain. It's our attitude. This is the most important aspect, to recognize that our suffering is based on our attitude, and therefore our peace of mind is also attitudinal and not ever circumstantial. So this is where the mantra within this teaching can start kicking in for people. The mantra is, my happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. My happiness is to be found in my attitude to the flow of life. So once we become familiar with it, the different forms of suffering that arise, when they arise, one of the mantras that can cut it off. It's not really a mantra, it's just a deeply ingrained understanding. The suffering can arise. We recognize it's got to do with our attitude to the circumstance and not the circumstance itself. We'll talk about what the attitude is. In large part, the attitude is saying my happiness is to be found in circumstance, right? Which doesn't make it to be found in circumstance. But if we have the attitude that says it is to be found in circumstance, which is part of the attachment to outcomes, then that relationship with circumstance is going to create an uncomfortableness. And if we become familiar with that, the thought can arise, actually, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. So it's just a remembering that may cut off the involvement, what's happening in the flow of life, an involvement that keeps us disconnected from our true nature and makes us feel uncomfortable. Essentially, it's a set of thoughts that say what I am is being attacked by life circumstance being a particular way. And so that story, that narrative, that attitude includes in it essentially our psychological identity, our psychological sense of who we are. And while the story is active, there is an uncomfortableness with life, with ourself. So we feel uncomfortable. That's the suffering. And in an instant, a thought can arise. My happiness is just remembering one of the basic wisdoms that hopefully we've come to see for ourselves. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. And it brings us back into our core, our essence. It drags us out of the involvement that we have temporarily found ourselves attitudinally involved in circumstance. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. And we come back to resting in our own being and find that as soon as I disengage with the circumstance, I'm grounded again. I'm at peace. And then we smile and say, oh, here I am. Here I am. Here I exist, complete and unchallenged at my core. Whereas when the attitude was in involvement, the attitude, meaning the narrative, the sense of self, was feeling completely attacked by the circumstance. Now, our true self was never attacked. But if the psychological identity jumps in on center stage, it gets its day in the sun. And then that means that our experience has to be an experience of the uncomfortableness of the psychological self that is doing its suffering dance. And what I'm describing here is essentially the default structure of humanity, the default structure of human beings. An attitude to life that brings into existence a psychological self that is forced to feel uncomfortable with the unfolding of life according to God's will, destiny unfolding. That psychological self is always going to feel uncomfortable because it's not our true self. And therefore, the true self is relegated to the background. And the benefit, the essence, the nature of our true self is in a way temporarily foregone in exchange for the experience of our vulnerable and false sense of self. So this is really great news if you have listened, if what I have said has been able to be received. It can be really great news because it says that your true nature, everyone's true nature, when our true nature is not covered up by the false sense of self, is continuous unbroken peace of mind in daily living. That's our birthright. That's what seeking is all about. Which means even if you find yourself evicted from your home unfairly, find yourself on the streets, the circumstance is no doubt unfortunate. The circumstance is maybe very dangerous, maybe very physically uncomfortable. You may have to sleep in a tent or on a park bench. You may not have money for food, so you could be hungry. Now, so none of these things are pleasant. They're all circumstantial, and they're all part of the flow of life, either pleasure or pain. So what I've just described here is unfortunate circumstance. However, someone who has found themselves grounded in their essence will essentially understand that, yes, this is the flow of life. This is destiny unfolding. And circumstance is not a dictator of my inner being. And so the involvement in the circumstance from the perspective of the false psychological self that is convinced that this circumstance is an attack on their happiness, that won't arise for the seeker in which the psychological identity has been sufficiently diminished, sufficiently dissolved, sufficiently undone. So that's really what the seeking is about. The seeking is about a movement that over time, because of our earnestness as seekers, a movement that because of our earnestness of seekers diminishes, dissolves the part of the human being that can only suffer. And so when that aspect of the human dissolves, the individual, the human being is still there. The human being is forced to live life until physical death comes, living according to their destiny. And how much pleasure and how much pain is destined in someone's life is, according to the concept in this teaching, already predetermined. And the individual is not in control of how much pleasure and pain is going to be delivered in their life. However, if the attitude of personal doership and the attitude of attachment to outcomes falls away, that person, regardless of the pleasure and pain, will remain at peace, will remain connected to their essence without the psychological identity, which manifests in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. Without that load on top of the load of pleasure and pain of the flow of life. So that's why this is good news, because it means suffering is very much something that can come to an end. If suffering was a natural part of who we really are, then you'd have to conclude, well, there's no way out of it. But it turns out that suffering is a part of the human being that has been put in place by life, and it's a part of the human being that can be dissolved by life. Now, if we approach seeking from the perspective of being interested in it only when things go wrong, unfortunately, that's just going to lead to frustration. It's not going to lead to significant change. It's a bit like being told that you need to swim the English Channel or complete a marathon when you've never done any training. And so if the day before the marathon you suddenly start getting interested, or when the marathon starts you start getting interested and you start asking questions of experts, so how should I do this? What should I pace myself and go slowly at the beginning and what's the strategy? You're not prepared. You're not conditioned to undertake that challenge in a way other than a way that is going to be unsuccessful. So a seeker that is interested in seeking only when the times get tough, when suffering is really intense, is simply not going to be equipped to deal with the suffering. It's not something that you can dissolve just because you have the intention of doing it in the moment. Whereas a seeker that finds themselves motivated even when times are not particularly extreme, then the change happens gradually. And when tough circumstance lands, we find that our attitude has been changed slowly over an extended period of time. So if our peace of mind has to do with our attitude to the flow of life and not the flow of life itself, we should ask ourselves a question: what is the attitude that leads to suffering? And what is the attitude that leads to unbroken peace of mind? We can start to see this attitude in action for ourselves once we have asked this question and got a good, satisfactory answer to it. Until we ask a very logical question and get a good answer to it, we may not see what is actually leading to the suffering. So the description in the teaching is that it's the attitude of doership and the attitude of attachment to outcome that is the basis on which the suffering arises. And it's the dissolving of the attitude of personal doership and the attitude of attachment to outcomes that means suffering can no longer arise. So in brief, what is the attitude of personal doership and what is the attitude of attachment to outcomes? And the answer is this: the attitude of personal doership is an attitude that sees oneself as a separate, independent entity that is in control of everything that they think, say, and do. Meaning that the words, the thoughts, the emotions, and the actions are all happening because the individual, of their own free will and volition, unaffected by anything else, so not influenced by anything else, chooses in each moment exactly how they are going to function and has proprietary over that, has control and volition over everything that happens through them. That is the attitude of personal doership. Now, to a lot of people, that seems like a very realistic and valid attitude to have about oneself, because that's their experience, that it's them that is doing the talking and doing the thinking and the feeling and the actions. As we investigate this and investigate how the movements of the human being, and in fact what the human being is, we can get to a point where our view of ourself and our view of the other is so radically different to what it used to be that the notion of looking at ourselves as the doer, meaning imagining ourselves as some entity that in each moment controls and determines exactly how they function, becomes so unpalatable, so unacceptable, so clearly inaccurate, that the notion of personal doership has essentially fallen away. The attitude of personal doership has fallen away. So to the majority of humans on Earth, the attitude of personal doership is part of their self-identity, part of their idea about who they are, which makes up the psychological identity that essentially interacts with whatever happens in the flow of life. So if we see ourselves as the doer, we're forced to see the other person. So we know ourselves as a person. And if we know ourselves as a person and see ourselves as the doer, we have to project the same onto the others, that each of the others are the same as me, a separate independent entity in complete control of everything that happens through them, everything they do. With this attitude, we're forced to continually judge the other and oneself as the doer, and therefore judge ourselves and the other as potentially needing to and should have functioned differently so that the outcomes were optimal according to my preferences. So that is the basis of guilt and blame and pride. We blame the other for those actions that happen through them that don't deliver pleasure to myself or someone that I love, or even to a complete stranger. We blame them as if they are the doer and therefore say you should have and you could have done it differently. Guilt and shame is the same attitude of personal doership projected onto ourselves. We see ourselves as the doer, so when an action happens through us that is not doesn't deliver an outcome that is in line with my preferences, I hate myself. I see myself as unworthy. I see myself as not good enough. I see myself as having functioned invalidly, because my attitude based on personal doership doesn't accept that there really is no good or bad, but rather just the spontaneous functioning according to the human being's genes and up-to-date conditioning or design or makeup in that moment. The belief in personal doership doesn't see whatever the outcome, pleasurable or painful, positive or negative, it doesn't see it as the only thing that could happen. It doesn't see it as a valid outcome in the infinite possibilities of life. It judges it as valid or invalid. It judges it as being in line with my preference and therefore my expectation, or out of line with my preference and therefore out of line with my expectation of how life should be. Now, this is when our thinking changes, when we start to see how life actually works, how the human beings work, this becomes a completely unpalatable attitude. It no longer makes sense. It is no longer how we see life. It's no longer how we see ourselves and how we see the other. When the belief in personal doership falls away, it becomes very obvious that throughout the ever-changing and unfolding storyline of life, everyone is intrinsically part of that storyline. Everyone is essentially being birthed in each moment out of life, out of the present moment is like the crest of a wave moving forward. The life is always the crest of the wave. And all of the human beings and their actions are part and parcel of the crest of the wave. And life is completely predetermined to be exactly the way it is in each moment. Myself and the other, including my attitude and my thoughts and my feelings and my actions, are all happening according to destiny, happening according to God's will, happening according to life, which is one big movement, singular, total movement, of which nothing is separate, nothing is outside of life. The birds, the trees, the oceans, the wind, the humans, the thoughts, the emotions, the attitude is all enveloped in life, is all part of life. Nothing exists outside of life. It is our attitude of personal doership that essentially separates us. It creates a perspective of ourself that is no longer integrated and one with the movement of life. It is an attitude that creates a division that isn't really there. And for as long as that attitude, which is a divisive attitude, is in play, the oneness of life, the spontaneousness of life, the destiny of life is not able to be seen. So this notion of God's will, of destiny, of everything being exactly the way that it is designed to be, is essential in order for our attitude to change, in order for the suffering that is so habitual to start getting cut off. And as the suffering gets cut off, it means the psychological identity is getting weaker and weaker. If the outputs of the psychological identity continue to function without another part of ourselves, without the working mind or the intellect interfering in the movement of the thinking mind, which is the psychological self, if the working mind doesn't get equipped, doesn't start to see life differently, then the psychological self will continue to run riot. And each time it functions, it's reinforcing itself. And so as part of destiny, for some people, life brings about new conditioning that describes life differently. That description creates a fire within the individual. That fire drives the seeking. The seeking can become more and more focused, which means the understanding and the recognition of life in such a way that interferes with the suffering becomes more and more of a happening, of a thing. And the change in the human being takes place, all according to destiny, not my doing or your doing, but part of the unfolding of life. So even our attitude to life is not in our control. And how do we start to see this? We have to see that the human being, if we look at it from a causal perspective, the biological aspect of the human being, which is our biological preferences and how our intellect works, our functional intellect works, down to the color of our eyes and how strong we are, or how emotional, what our different strengths and weaknesses are. All of the biological aspects of the human are part of its makeup that has developed moment after moment throughout life as part of the genetic structure growing, and the genetic structure being impacted moment after moment by the new conditioning of life. So the human being in any moment is a result of these factors. The human being has been grown by life, never separate from life. So these factors are really an expression of life, just like the tree is an expression of life and the bird is an expression of life. The human being has been extruded out of life from the 5 elements, is how it's described in some teachings. All consciousness in other teachings, all energy in other teachings. Essentially, energy in different forms, consciousness in different forms, the 5 elements in different forms that create the whole of life. And that includes the human being with its biological makeup and the human being with its psychological makeup, which means the psychological identity that sees life a certain way, sees itself as the doer, sees the other as the doer, that has been imposed on the human being by life, by the coming together of the parents, the egg and the sperm coming together, the entity growing, the society that it was born into, the friends it had, the teachers it had, the parents it had, none of these two factors, its genes or its new conditioning, which becomes part of its up-to-date conditioning, was part and parcel. None of it was in the control of the human being. So a bonsai tree that, a seed of a tree that grows in a sort of very confined pot, sort of in the side of a mountain on a rocky ground, the bonsai tree is forced to only get to a certain size because the roots are contained within a very small area. And so the tree wasn't in control of the fact that the seed fell in a area that contained the root system, and therefore it was confined, it was forced to be a bonsai. And that's how all of us are. So our attitude, which is part of the psychological aspect of the human, and the biological aspect, not in our control, part of destiny. And the changes that happen, should an earthquake happen and a rock on the mountain split open, then the tree that is a bonsai might find that the roots can spread out. And if they find fertile ground, which is not in the tree's control, the tree may then start to grow differently. And that's not in the tree's control as to how it grows. It's just biological. And so a bonsai can, if destined, turn into a normal sized tree. And that's the same with the human being. The destiny of a seeker and how effective teachings are and how the teachings are received and what changes happen internally, not in the control of the one putting forward the teaching and not in control of the one receiving the teaching. Once the person has received the teaching, they're not in control of the contemplations that happen, not in control of how life is observed. And we have to observe life for ourselves. We have to see what is being pointed at for ourselves. And as we see it and little light bulb moments go off, that is the deepening of the understanding based on an observation for ourselves. So this coming to see life as predetermined, coming to see ourself as not the doer, coming to see everything as God's will or life's will, is the basis of the understanding that is a shift from ignorance to knowledge, or ignorance to understanding. Now, I'm not talking about a knowledge, an intellectual knowledge. I'm not talking about an intellectual understanding. I'm talking about a seeing of life in such a way that it wasn't seen before. And as that seeing happens, it becomes obvious that it was always like that, but it was never deeply recognized as that. And things continue to unfold more or less on a circumstantial level as they did before. People in your life functioning a particular way in a particular moment, delivering pleasure or pain. Now your attitude to the pleasure or pain is radically different to what it was. No longer the attitude where you see the person as a separate, independent entity doing something to you, but rather you see it as destiny unfolding. You see it as your destiny in this moment to receive pain, and you see it as the destiny of the other to be the one that delivered the pain. Your destiny for the other to function exactly the way they function in order for the pain that you are destined to receive to be delivered. All part of God's will. Now, this moves us on to the second aspect of our attitude that delivers suffering. And that aspect or that attitude is the attitude of attachment to outcome, which simply means that we have a deeply ingrained idea of ourselves, along with the idea that I am the doer, that my completeness is going to be found in the future based on circumstance being a particular way. So what that's saying is I am not complete at the moment, and we have this idea of ourselves because this identity is in place. We feel uncomfortable, which means there isn't a sense of completeness. There's a sense of uncomfortableness. And then a story is developed, a rationale is developed, a reason or a justification for the uncomfortableness. Not really a justification, but what we believe is the cause of the uncomfortableness, because we're not understanding the uncomfortableness to be attitudinal. We believe the uncomfortableness is because of circumstance, and therefore our attitude is this uncomfortableness is because of circumstance. And so when circumstance changes in such a way that I imagine will deliver completeness at some point in the future, then I will have completeness. That attitude is completely false as the attitude of personal doership. It is an attitude based on a misunderstanding of who we are, an attitude based on a disconnection from who we are, an attitude that stems out of the psychological self, which essentially is a false idea of who we are, a false idea of who the other is, and a false idea of what life is. As this attachment to outcome gets recognized as the basis of our suffering, and now we can talk about worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. As we understand that it's my belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, meaning my happiness is to be found in the flow of life, which is the circumstance that changes moment after moment after moment. And we see that that attitude leads to a worry about what might come in the future, a worry, and in its extreme form, anxiety, a sense of dread about the body being physically attacked, and ultimately a very deep sense of fear. And that is because the psychological identity knows itself primarily as the physical. It has no experience or recognition of the core of the human being. The experience of the human being hasn't included a resting in its essence that is essentially the place outside of the psychological identity. So as we start to recognize that my happiness is not to be found in outcomes, but in my attitude. And when the attitude is an attitude devoid of seeking outwardly, we get to rest inwardly. And as we rest inwardly, we receive the benefit of knowing our essence. And as we know our essence more and more and realize that this is peace, what I am at my core is peace. I could find myself needing to take shelter overnight on the street. And to the extent that I can remind myself and come back to my core, in that moment, I can be at peace, even in the face of challenging circumstances. Now, this can sound like just theory to the belief in personal doership that would feel completely affronted, not even in the moment, but just at the thought of this, at the thought of such a unfolding in life. The psychological identity is petrified. It feels completely assaulted. So this notion that we can be at peace even in the face of very challenging circumstance seems completely unrealistic to the psychological identity. However, when it starts to become our own experience, we realize, my loved one has died. And yet when I rest in my being, I can feel sad at the fact that someone I love is no longer in my life. They will still be in my heart, but not in my life. So I can feel sad, but not to the extent where the sadness turns into a completely penetrating grief, When sadness turns into a completely penetrating grief, we have no connection with our own essence that is really unchallenged. And we only know our imaginary sense of self that feels completely attacked when it loses security, when it loses the love of someone else. Really, the movement is really about us starting to experience, which really means a change starting to happen. And that change happens when the seeking becomes part of our everyday life, where inquiry and investigation along the lines of what I'm pointing at becomes something that takes over and happens automatically. Happens when you're walking through the park, when you're at the shops, when you're driving in your car and someone cuts you off and the anger arises, and on top of the anger, the blame and hatred towards the other. A blame and hatred that can extend the judgment towards the other horizontally in time, sometimes for years. Hopefully not in relation to someone cutting you off in the car, but when personal circumstances take a turn for the worst, we can hold on to what the other person has done, or at least what we perceive as the doer having done to me. And we can hold on to that with an attitude of resentment and hatred for years and years and years, a whole lifetime. So as our seeking becomes intense and we start seeing this and seeing all the different forms of suffering, and they start getting cut off, what we find is the load of guilt and shame that we've carried around for a lifetime just falls away. And that means that the pleasure and pain of life needs to be experienced, continues to be experienced, but now no longer with the additional, sometimes much more intense and uncomfortable load of guilt and blame and pride and attachment to outcomes. And that is peace of mind. And when that becomes our experience, then we know for ourselves that all I'm looking for in life is life free of suffering. Because when life is free of suffering, we're not looking for something more. We are happy to accept any pleasures that get bestowed upon us as part of the flow of life. And we understand that life is always also going to put obstacles and pains in our way, and we endure those pains with the same understanding. And yet we find that there isn't the suffering, there isn't the uncomfortableness with oneself and with the other. So, having given you an introductory to this satsang for over an hour, I would like to see if we can get an interactivity happening on the system that we have. So if anyone has any contributions that you'd like to make, then please put your hand up electronically on Zoom, and the moderator will pick someone, and we'll see how we go with an interaction.
I have a reading.
Okay.
You say that peace of mind results from continuous connection to source. It implies that there are two, the source and the one that has to be connected to the source. Are there two? If so, then what is non-duality?
Mm-hmm. So you're correct. It implies that, and there aren't two. There are layers of the human being, and so the layers of the human being can be disconnected which really means the human being doesn't appreciate a layer that is part of them. And when a layer that is hidden presents itself, it can feel like a connection. And so therefore it's described that way in terms of words. And if there's many different ways of describing things based on sort of how you see it. And the thing itself is far too complex. So in a way, we're always going to have our models of it. And so depending on what model we hold in front of us will be how the words come out. Now, models can be a problem if we think the model is the thing itself. But if we're aware that the model is the thing, that it's just a model that we have, and we're talking and trying to describe a model, then it doesn't actually get in the way of us being connected. So what you've picked up on is excellent. It sounds like there are two. So it feels like a connection when we drop out of the thinking mind, and that stops, and we rest in being. There is actually just the being. So in that moment, there aren't two. But in the experience, it feels like there is the thinking mind, where there is involvement in the outcomes, which means the awareness of the human being is projected onto one layer and the core is lost. In a sense, it's still there, but it's lost. And when the working mind comes up and recognizes that the suffering is happening and cuts off the suffering, it feels like, oh, we are connected to source. But once we're resting there, then we wouldn't say, I feel connected. Well, we could say I feel connected to source, but what we would mean is I'm resting in my being. And once again, it depends on how you describe it. You could call your being the source of the human experience. Especially if we recognize that our being is essentially consciousness. Now, why it's sometimes referred to as connected to source is because there is a sense that that consciousness exists prior to the body. In certain meditations, in certain states, there is a very clear sense that consciousness is actually prior to the body, and the body arises within consciousness. Now, the fact that that sense and even that experience, that state, experiential state happens isn't proof that the consciousness is prior to the body. And yet, if someone has that model in a way, knowing that it's a model, but they say, yeah, but that works for me to say that my essence is actually the essence of source, that it's source functioning through the body. And when source functions through the body, it functions as personal consciousness, functioning through a particular instrument. And we can then say that the consciousness through the instrument, seeing life from a particular perspective, the human perspective, is personal consciousness. And so once again, you can then say, oh, I, meaning the personal consciousness, am really connected to source, meaning I'm not disconnected from source. Having said that, internally, will know, if the model that you have allows it, that even the word connected to source can sound like it implies two, but really what it means is, for example, white light and a filter. And let's say the filter is a red filter, and in the analogy, the filter is the equivalent of the body-mind organism. And once the white light goes through the filter, what comes out on the other side is red light. And so you could say that the red light is connected to the white light, or the red light is an expression of the white light. And so when you describe it like that, just because of language, there is the sense or the implication that there is two, white light and red light, and that they are separate. Whereas when we're looking at this analogy, we see the white light goes through the filter and becomes red light. And the essence of the red light is essentially the white light. So that was a very long way around essentially saying there aren't two, but the one source, when it manifests in a unique way, is still the same source. It has a unique expression. And on another side, the dropping out of the thinking mind and dropping into being, which really means the thinking mind just dissolving, creates a sense of dropping from a place of disconnection into a connection with our beingness. Now, is there non-dual, or what is non-duality? Non-duality doesn't mean that there isn't distinction. So if we look at a dream at night, everything arises within the dream experience. And the dream experience must arise in consciousness, because there has to be awareness of the dream in order for the dream to be experienced. So a dream is a great example of what Advaita describes as the experience of life. It is a singular arising in consciousness, a dream that is really one dream, one momentary experience. And yet within the dream, there could be many people, there could be deck chairs and trees and sun and birds, all of which appear to be separate, appear to be individual. And yet from outside, you see it is a single appearance, a single happening. And so to life, there is the experience of separation. There is the experience of many people, many objects. And yet from a certain perspective, if you stand back, it's similar to watching a picture on the wall in a museum. The picture might be a picture of 20 trees, picture of a forest. And if you single in on each tree, you could say there are many trees. And as you zoom out, you could say there is one forest. And as if you zoom out even more, you just say it is a single picture. And the content is not so important. So in life, life is a paradox. In essence, you can say that life is a non-duality. Everything arises within life and part and parcel of life. Nothing is separate from life. So that is the non-duality. And then when you go down onto the relative level includes a sense of separation because of space and specific objects, which are really the life force manifesting in many different forms. And so there's this paradox. So non-duality doesn't mean the absence of duality. Non-duality means the absence of dualism. So the difference between duality and dualism is significant. Duality is the nature of the non-duality. What that means is that the non-dual experience is an experience of interconnected opposites. So the yin-yang symbol is a great example of this. The yin-yang symbol is there to demonstrate that actually it is a single symbol, but within that single symbol, there are the interconnected and supporting opposites, the black and the white, which is a representation of duality. And yet, if we are lost in seeing only the black and the white, we don't see the whole. We see two, and we don't realize they make up a whole. And so when there is a recognition of non-duality, often what has happened in order to bring about the recognition of non-duality, we've had to condition the mind to stop seeing distinction. And if we get the mind to stop seeing distinction, it can open up enough to see the whole. And when it sees the whole, often it then has a lot of trouble reintegrating and acknowledging distinction. And that in itself is an unintegrated perspective of non-duality. It essentially has flipped from only seeing duality to now seeing non-duality without any duality. Whereas as I experience life, life is a paradox, which is a non-dual experience, but an experience of duality. Dualism is the attitude that sees things separate and doesn't see them as part of the whole. And therefore, dualism brings about the attitude of personal doership, because when someone acts and when something moves, it's not seen as a result of the greater whole, but it's seen as you're doing as a separate individual entity. So dualism versus duality is an attitudinal separation that can't integrate what appears to be separate and hold it also as part of the whole. So I hope that in my usual long-winded way goes somewhat to answering your question. The connection to source is something that I talk about. So how I would just the concepts that are used. Our continuous unbroken peace of mind, continuous unbroken peace of mind is there because of our continuous recognition of our connection to source, which really means the recognition that we are not one or not separate from life. So life is the source of all of this. Life is not outside of all of this. Life is all of this, and we are part of all of this. So our connection to source, meaning our recognition of our oneness with source, is what means the end of dualism, the end of the attitude of personal doership, the end of the attitude of separation. The attitude of separation is the attitude that I am separate from life. Now, if I talk about not being separate, does that mean that I can't say that there is an I or a Roger? And that's exactly what I was laying the grounds for in the first part of the answer, is that the paradox is that in experience, there is a Roger, and in experience, Roger is separate from Daniela and separate from the tree and the couch. My experience is not that I am one and the same as everything else. However, there is a deep recognition that Roger doesn't exist independent from life, and Roger doesn't exist independent from the experience of life. And furthermore, the consciousness that functions through Roger is the same as the consciousness that functions through the other. So this oneness, this non-duality, can be described or can be justified from many different angles. The oneness and the non-separateness, the connection exists actually and can be described on very many levels. So often in teachings, the words are a concept. So we say that it's not the truth, it's a concept. And often they are figures of speech that most accurately describe a dynamic that is a useful dynamic for someone to see. So it's described. And the fact that you pick up on the fact that the concept seems contradictory or seems out of place is great. And hopefully I have put forward an explanation that satisfies.
Hey Roger, thank you for doing this. Can you hear me?
So, okay.
What is the difference between biological feelings and emotions and the feelings and emotions which cause suffering?
Great. So the human being is made up of the biological aspects and the psychological aspects, both of which are a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning. The psychological aspect of the human being in this teaching is described as being a result of very particular conditioning. The conditioning that puts in place the belief in personal doership and the belief that my happiness, my completeness is to be found in outcomes. So the human being as a whole generally includes both the biological aspects and the psychological aspects. The psychological aspects being based on a particular set of genes and a particular set of up-to-date conditioning, the up-to-date conditioning being specifically that which ingrains the belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome. The biological aspects also based on genes and up-to-date conditioning, but different up-to-date conditioning that doesn't reinforce or isn't part of the psychological identity. So your preferences are part of your biological makeup. Your personality is part of your biological makeup. Now, you may well, within your personality, there may well be the psychological aspect as well. But if someone's psychological aspect dissolves, what will be left is the biological. The biological isn't something that dissolves as a result of this investigation, this seeking, this change. What this change does is it dissolves the belief in personal doership, it dissolves the attachment to outcomes, and it does it by life, often through teachings, pointing out that certain attitudes to life cause suffering, and that those attitudes are probably based on an inaccurate perception or a surface level perception. So the teaching can dissolve the psychological, and yet the biological will remain. So my ability to do mathematics, my ability to wash myself and speak English, all of that based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, including the fact that I grew up in an English-speaking country and that my parents taught me when I was young how to use soap and how to use the shower. My capacity to drive a car is part of my biological makeup. My emotions and my capacities, for example, if I can run fast or can't run fast, whether I enjoy walking or I prefer skydiving, all of those can be part of my biological preferences. So when the psychological aspect falls away, often people, or the question that often comes up is, if my attachment to outcomes falls away, what is going to motivate me or drive me to move through life? And the answer is the psychological will fall away, and yet the biological aspects of the human being are still there. And so if you hear someone shouting for help, you will be moved by the biological aspect of the human being. The fact that you can hear is part of the biological. And once we've been conditioned to understand that help means that someone's in danger, then the biological makeup is going to function exactly as it functions, but that might include going to see what one can do. If the doorbell rings, then the biological intelligence understands what that means, and we go towards the door. Hunger arising is a result of a biological reaction in the body. So we get moved to the fridge, and tiredness is part of a biological reaction in the body. Now, two biological movements that are very often misinterpreted as being psychological movements are anger and sadness. And the reason that anger and sadness are misinterpreted as being psychological is because they tend to be painful biological movements. So all your biological movements have a degree of pleasure and pain in them. So hunger arises and it's painful. It drives us to go and get food, and that pain gets satisfied usually relatively quickly. And it doesn't turn into suffering. But anger and sadness tend to be quite intense emotions inspired by usually, inspired by circumstance. And when the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome is there, there is an intertwining of blame and attachment to outcomes that pervades anger and sadness with the uncomfortableness of suffering. And so when we experience anger and sadness, we're not really experiencing pure anger and pure sadness. We're experiencing the biological reaction, which happens vertically in time based on a circumstance that's happening. So if someone comes and pushes me, my biological intelligence might say, get angry and push back. Now, that's if the doership and attachment to outcome has dissolved. The pushing is a biological response. It's part of the biological intelligence, or at least the biological makeup of the body. And what we have trouble understanding is, like, if you don't blame the other, if the doership, if the psychological identity has fallen away and you accept life as it is, why would you get angry? Because anger, it seems, is a non-acceptance of life. It's like, they push you, and acceptance means that you would be equanimitous. The equanimity is pointing to equanimity inside over a horizontal extension in time. The biological response that is vertical in time is the biological intelligence of the body. And it would equate to seeing a friend that you haven't seen for a long time, maybe one of your closest friends, and you haven't seen them for 10 years, and they surprise you. They come into the room. Now, if attachment to outcome has fallen away, on the basis that someone assumes that without attachment to outcome, if someone were to push you when you are out in the street, let's say push you off the pavement into, and you're about to fall onto the street, and you might grab hold of them and use them to get back balance, and you might also sort of push them away to prevent them from doing it to you again. Now, someone might say that's, shows some form of attachment. But would we expect the sage who is no longer has the psychological identity to see a friend that they haven't seen for 10 years, a friend that surprises them? Would you expect the sage to remain equanimitous on a biological level? No, you would expect them to be surprised, to be excited, like, wow, why are you here? This is amazing, it's fantastic. That's the excitement. That is part of the biological reaction. And it makes sense in the circumstance. What doesn't make sense is if the biological reaction is then turned into a psychological story that extends horizontally in time. So sadness and anger can happen, and if they are just part of the biological emotions of the human being and don't get turned into a story about how the pleasure or pain of life is an attack or an addition to who I am at my core, then it's part of the biological. If it gets turned into a story about why the circumstance is an addition or an attack and why the other is the cause of that, then it falls into the realm of psychological. And what is most important is that the psychological feels uncomfortable on a level of self, and the biological doesn't feel uncomfortable on a level of self. It may be painful, but doesn't include the bitterness and the uncomfortableness that the psychological reactions have. Both the biological and the psychological, when they happen, are spontaneous. Neither of them are in your control. Both of them are based on genes and up-to-date conditioning. The attitude towards both of them needs to be, as I've described. The reason why they are conceptually separated and described separately is because the psychological are based on the deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to the outcomes. The biological are not, both of which feel different and create a different sense of self. And so by describing them separately, even though they are neither of them are our doing, but both of them are spontaneous arisings based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning, describing them separately then allows our intellect to start discerning between the different arisings as part of our ongoing investigation of how life happens.
If we are aiming for happiness through peace of mind, isn't that expecting life to be a particular way? Doesn't that fall under attachment to the outcome?
These are fantastic questions. You see, it all comes down to your attitude towards the notion of peace of mind. So a lot of teachings won't dare to describe what seeking is really about, because the truth is that a teaching understands that the doership and attachment to outcome in the human being is so strong that as soon as it describes a potential outcome, which I'll show you in this teaching is just a description of what may happen. And it's very important for us to hear that description if we're ready, because it will allow the seeking to become much, much more focused than if the description isn't given. However, if the doership and attachment to outcome hears the description and says, fantastic, now I know what I need in life, I am going to make this happen. I am the one that will control life such that I make it happen, and it's what I need, which then means that if it isn't delivered, the doer is going to feel uncomfortable. So the risk is that the doer, with its attachment to outcomes, turns the description about what the seeking is really about, turns it into an expectation. And then that expectation is in itself suffering that is getting in the way of the peace of mind. So what I started saying at the beginning of the talk is that it's so important to understand what we're really looking for, peace of mind. It's so important for us to understand that peace of mind is simply the absence of suffering and not the gaining of anything. It's so important for us to understand that peace of mind is always on the level of attitude and not on the level of circumstance. And as we understand this, we'll start to see the various forms of suffering that arise in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And as we see these expectations, these worries, these pride, blame, and guilt arise, our intellect that has been equipped with the descriptions can then see it, feel the uncomfortableness, because all suffering has an uncomfortableness in it, and will then, hopefully, only if it has found itself in a teaching that has described these things, be able for itself, in a way, the working mind will see that turning the description of what may or may not happen into an expectation that we hold on to, it will see that when suffering is there, the expectation and the desire for peace of mind actually becomes the thing that makes the suffering even more uncomfortable, because there will be secondary suffering, which is the resistance to the suffering, because we have an expectation that life should be peace of mind. So the really great question. And what I would say is these are not, everything in the teaching is just a description and not a prescription. So it isn't, when I say happiness for the human being is peace of mind, I'm not telling the human being that you have to go and achieve peace of mind, turn it into an expectation, and think that you can do it of your own doing. It's just a description. It's the deeply ingrained doership and attachment to outcome within the seeker that hears that description, that then turns it into an attachment and an outcome and a benchmark against which to feel frustrated when the inevitable suffering that is still going to arise from time to time arises. And it's in time, these nuances will be seen, and then the attitude towards the description will refine itself such that the description remains. It becomes a useful description that helps the seeker understand what is theoretically available, but then also say, but my destiny may not include that. So an attachment to that outcome is another form of ignorance, another form of not recognizing that life is destined to unfold only one way in each moment, that my whole life is destined, the seeking is destined, and the outcomes are destined. Thank you.